Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This time we have on the podcast Jake Berman, who goes by 53 Studio on the subreddit, and we're here to talk about American public transit. So, hi Jake.
Hi, good morning. And to talk about why mass transit is so missing in North America compared to the rest of the planet.
Yeah, and I mean, because that's going to be the general topic, I mean, what would you sort of give as the general pitch?
So the place to start, obviously, is that there was no conspiracy by the auto and tire and bus industries to get rid of the streetcar systems in North America, because that's the question that I get asked most frequently. It's more that it's that in North America, for the most part, public transport was considered a business for much longer than it was, say, in Europe. And so, whereas it was considered unusual for the city of San Francisco or the city of Detroit to buy out their streetcar systems early, in most places, it staggered along until the 1940s, and in some cases as late as the 1970s. And these were widely reviled monopolies that were not particularly good at their jobs. But there's also other elements that play into this, like labor issues and the role of freeway mania, and the simple fact that North America was not destroyed by World War II, so the United States, and to a lesser extent Canada, could implement these utopian types of plans to remake the city for the automobile in a way that Europe just did not have the time or the patience for, because the whole thing was bombed. The whole continent was bombed out.
Hmm. So when we talk about, when you mention monopolies, are we talking about sort of government monopolies on transit or earlier monopolies that were then bought out?
So we're talking about privately owned monopolies. And in an era before the automobile, the motor bus, and the truck, if you didn't have any means of transportation, like, say, a horse, or you weren't wealthy enough to own a car, then your alternative was either pay the fare or walk. And just to give a sense of this, the Detroit United Railway in Detroit happened to own a railway system and local streetcar system that blanketed the entire Metro Detroit area even today. And the thing was, because they were a privately owned monopoly that had consolidated all of the competing streetcar companies under their umbrella, they really did exert tremendous amounts of power over local government. And so, in a sense, when it came time for good government types to challenge these types of corrupt monopolies, they really were public enemy number one. So, like in Detroit, it was good government progressives that said, well, we could build a subway system, but we'd have to cooperate with the Detroit United Railway in order to build this subway, and we're not going to do that. We're going to buy out the Detroit United Railway, and we'll figure out this subway business later. And of course, Detroit never built a subway because of the Great Depression.
And to get a sense of chronology with all this, when was the Detroit United Railway bought out? So
the Detroit United Railway was bought in 1922. So just to give a general chronology of the streetcar era, the electric streetcar is invented in the 1890s in Richmond, Virginia, in the United States, and the technology spreads extremely quickly to all over the U.S. and Canada. And this, and by and large, between then and 1920 or 1930, all of these are privately owned monopolies that have all transportation within a particular, all public transportation within a particular metropolitan area under their control. So these types of monopolies then began losing money in the late 20s and early 30s during the Great Depression, and then ultimately ended up shutting down around World War II. Some of them crept on, but they were universally under government control by about 1970 or 1975.
One thing that I'm I guess, a little unclear on, because I don't really do US transport history, obviously, is why the government then sort of got rid of the streetcar and didn't replace it.
So a lot of this can be traced back to the poor reputation of privately owned streetcar companies. So, for instance, in they had justifiable reputations for being gigantic dicks and corrupt. So this is a little bit blunt to say it, but like the Market Street Railway in San Francisco hired away the Attorney General of the state of California. So the man resigned from a statewide elected position to become the chief lawyer for a streetcar company. And a few years later, Attorney General Ford was indicted and arrested on bribery charges because he was offering bribes on behalf of the Market Street Railway. So there was no love lost between the citizenry and these transit companies, compared to Europe, where the government generally took over public transport relatively early, and it was considered a public service throughout the period. And I mean, to add to that, North American streetcar companies generally would be running streetcars on routes that would not be economical. So in the privately run era, it was considered that, well, if the thing doesn't make money for the company, it makes perfect sense to close down the line and replace it with a bus, because buses are cheaper to run on a low capacity line since they don't require track maintenance, overhead wires, and that stuff. The advantages of rail are that you can move large numbers of people quickly, but to do that, you need to have dedicated rights of way, that is, their own lanes or trackways, and you need to run long trains, and that looks an awful lot like the New York City subway or the London Tube or some of the tram lines that you see like in the Czech Republic, where you'll see these like long trains that run in the median.
I mean, we've established at this point then that it really has very little to do with automotive industry lobbying, which is the standard narrative. But what I'm kind of curious about is how that narrative came about. Is it a recent thing that's sort of sprung up, or does it have roots in some kind of older trend?
My personal thought is that it's a revisionist history that came about in the 1970s and 1980s. Especially in the United States, as all of the problems with widespread freeway construction became well known. In the early 1950s, Los Angeles was treated as this miraculous place where everyone could have their own little house, and they could have their car, and they could get to work zipping along at 70 miles an hour from their home to their job and to the store and everything else. And my dad used to tell me stories growing up of, on the East Coast, LA was thought of as this kind of utopia. But by the 1970s, it was treated as like LA had become this kind of smoggy suburban hell. And it's never really shaken that. It's never really shaken that reputation. And to the point that in 1976, when Los Angeles County held a referendum on whether to build a subway, it was marketed as the route of the new red cars. And this is the same system that everyone was trying to get rid of and to shut it down only 30 years before. In a sense, it's much easier to believe in a conspiracy and than to really confront the fact that history is complicated, and there were very, very good reasons at the time for making the decisions to get rid of the red cars in Los Angeles. And the process was like that in a whole lot of different places. Canada is slightly different than the United States because Canadians started on their freeway planning later than the US. So a place like Vancouver has almost no freeways at all because their freeway planning began in the late 1960s and 1970s. And by then, they had learned the lessons of Los Angeles, which is that not everybody necessarily wants to be stuck in traffic all day.
And yet, kind of American mass transit is still kind of bad, as you've described. And despite what seems to have been a sort of 70s backlash, was it simply that it was a relatively moderate backlash, or were there sort of forces that prevented it from turning into a more effective force for change?
So in the United States, the big thing is not the amount of mass transit that exists, right? So a place like Los Angeles has a metro system the size of Barcelona's. But Barcelona gets significantly more ridership despite the fact that Barcelona is smaller than Los Angeles. And the biggest reason for this is that in the United States, the land use policies, the laws that govern what you can build and where they're designed to promote suburban development, and it's usually not legal to build apartment buildings near train stations like it was in the old days. So if you go to, for instance, if you go to a modern subdivision that's built in Europe, like for example, Alcalá de Henares, which is a suburb of Madrid, where I did my study abroad in college, for the most part, they're built as row houses and 4 to 6 story apartment buildings that wouldn't be out of place in the year 1925 in the United States, or whatever I don't know what the British term for it is for a row house where the two where buildings are built right up next to each other.
Terraced houses. Terraced houses,
yes. Row houses or townhouses in the States, and so in Europe, for instance, like maybe 1 in 10 new homes is an American-style suburban like house sitting on its own plot, separated from other housing units. Stateside, if you look at that in Los Angeles, it's like 2/3 of all new housing are these separated suburban-style houses, and even where the demand exists, as in California, for apartment buildings near train stations, it's usually not legal. And because of that, it's hard to build the types of neighborhoods that you would build 100 years ago. And specifically, it's not a question of track mileage, it's a question of what can be built near what. And weirdly enough, there's a counterexample to the standard American development pattern in Houston, of all places, which is the ultimate horizontal city, where they built a light rail or tramway system within the city center, and Houston still has the loose land use laws of the past. And because of that, Houston has significant amounts of new development near the train stations because the land becomes more valuable if you have a train station nearby. And because of that, you do see this type of development compared to, say, Los Angeles or Dallas or San Jose or most American cities that have modern light rail or subway systems. Just they don't do this.
Yeah. Because as a point of comparison, I grew up in and still on and off live in Hong Kong, which is a city where there's plenty of neighborhoods that exist more or less solely because there is a metro station around which sort of all of this high density development goes.
Yeah, the MTR in Hong Kong is very much it is a subway company, but it also is a real estate developer.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that used to be very standard in North American land use planning, is that the people who built the trains and who built and ran the train stations were also the people who were developing the land near the stations. So that was actually one reason why the railway companies and the streetcar companies were so reviled, is that more often than not, a company that controlled transportation also controlled electricity, or they were the largest real estate developer within the region. So Atlanta, for instance, the electric company, Georgia Power, which still controls the power grid, they started out as a transport company because the electrical infrastructure that you would use to power a streetcar line could also be used to electrify a neighborhood. In Los Angeles, the old Pacific Electric Railway was owned by the same guy, Henry Huntington, who was also the biggest real estate developer in LA. So what Huntington would do is that he would buy up acres of worthless land and then run a line through it, and suddenly that worthless land is worth a lot of money, and you can build housing, you can build shops and things like that on that land. The difference is, in the 1920s in the United States and Canada, it was basically assumed that there was no other alternative to public transport. So there was never any real move to build the kinds of like high rises out in the burbs the way that you would see in Hong Kong.
Yeah. Kind of interesting, these transport companies building up sort of almost local empires in a way where they get this autonomy. And to what extent was the reaction in, say, the 20s and 30s? It's not just to do with the Depression, obviously, but let me rephrase that. To what extent was the reaction towards the transport companies and the increasing sort of government buyouts to do with almost sort of the principal problem of over large corporate entities, as opposed to the emergence of the automobile and the emergence of a clear alternative?
So in some cases, you'll have something like the red car system in Los Angeles, where they open up a bus company. And so the Pacific Electric Railway merged with the Motor Transit Company. And for a long time, the bus lines were still profitable well into the 1940s and 50s, in an era when the trains were losing money. In other cases, you have cut downs so that you keep the higher capacity of rail, but for like the busiest lines, but lesser used lines where it doesn't make sense to run trains, those would be converted to bus, like in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota. Albeit Minneapolis, St. Paul is a really weird case because the mafia got involved, and the streetcar shutdown was ultimately masterminded by the mob. That's a whole thing.
It is, but we have the time.
Yeah. So Minneapolis, St. Paul is so the Twin Cities, for the listeners who are not American or not familiar with Minnesota. The Twin Cities are the economic and political capital of the state of Minnesota. The state justifiably has a reputation for being Minnesota nice. That is, people are pleasant and extremely polite. It's not like, say, New York City or Philadelphia or Boston, where people are known for being jerks to each other. And there's very much a civic-mindedness to Minnesotans that's just part of their state DNA, if you will. And so the streetcar system and bus system was basically a family business and run by the Lowry family, and then the people who took over from them had a culture of basic competence. Like that's what they figured, this is something that we are providing to the public and to make a reasonable profit. And so in the late 1940s, on comes a fellow named Charles Green, who is one of those banker types from New York City who is stereotypically hard charging and says like, we're in this to make money, like this kind of like brash, pushy New Yorker that shows up in all kinds of financial movies, right? Charles Green is that guy. So Charles Green buys a bunch of the company stock and says, well, great, they're going to issue a big dividend. I'm going to make a bunch of money. that did not happen because the management of Twin City Rapid Transit said, no, we're going to reinvest this into basic maintenance, buying new trains, the kinds of things that we need to keep our system intact. And Green is not particularly happy about this. He says, well, I want to make my quick buck. I'm paraphrasing, obviously. But he says, damn, now I'm stuck with all of this stock. What am I going to do with this? I want my money. So Green calls up one of the largest shareholders in Twin City Rapid Transit and ultimately travels to Minneapolis to meet with a fellow named Isidore Blumenfield, who is the godfather of the Minneapolis mob. And, the kind of guy who like he got arrested for money laundering in Oklahoma, which is 1,000 miles south of Minneapolis. And the police chief of Minneapolis traveled to Oklahoma and testified in his behalf. Like, this is a stereotypical bootlegger who's going around murdering people and running prostitution rackets and bribing the police. Like, he knew, like Blumenfield machine gunned a newspaper editor and got away with it. And like that kind of fellow. He is also a major shareholder in Twin City Rapid Transit. So Green, the financier, flies to Minneapolis to talk to Blumenfield, alias Kid Can, because as a kid he would hide in the can. That is his mafia name. And so anyway, Kid Can and Green meet, and they bring in a political fixer named Ozana into the mix. So, it's these three guys, a crooked lawyer, a banker, and the godfather of the Minneapolis mob, saying, well, we're going to contact all of the shareholders and say that the management of the transit company is running everything into the ground. And then what follows is this big corporate battle between, on the one hand, the financier, the lawyer, and the mobster, and on the other hand, the longtime management of the company. And ultimately, they get forced out in 48 or 49 in favor of these crooks. And so Green, who is, like I said, he is this huge character of a New Yorker. He starts taking an axe to the company. He shuts down train lines with no notice. Like commuters get stranded. He fires like 800 workers, and just because reasons. And the things get so bad that the State Railway Commission has to take out a court order saying that Green can't close out any more lines without permission. So he's talking to the newspapers saying stuff like, this company has to turn a profit, and I will do it if I have to sell every streetcar and bus and sell it for scrap. I will make this company turn a profit. This does not work in a state that is famous for Minnesota nice. It doesn't work. Like, people in Minnesota do not have time or patience for this kind of jackass. And in the end, Ozana and Kid Can force out Green and say, no, you're out. We're stripping you of your powers. You're going to sell your shares and you're going to make your money, but you're getting the hell out of here. So Green is forced out, and he makes like $1 million and change in today's dollars in profits from being forced out. And of course, who buys all of Green's shares? It's the mob. So the Minneapolis mob and their associates just buy out all the shares so they control the company at this point. And the crooked lawyer, Fred Ozana, and Kid Can are now in charge. And what do? They still shut down all the streetcar lines, but they sell the assets at cut rate prices. So they're selling them, at discount rates and taking bribes to sell them at discount rates. So they steal like millions in today's money, and they take all these in bribes. This works great. So, Fred Ozana, who is the crooked lawyer, they give him, they burn the streetcars that couldn't be sold for scrap. And there's a picture of him that's in the state archive in Minnesota showing Ozana holding a gigantic check in front of a burning streetcar. All of this works great for a while until the feds find out about it and they indict everybody. And so Green the financier got away clean because they couldn't connect him to any illegal activity. But Kid Can and Ozana both end up getting arrested because, this is obviously a fraud. So Ozana ends up going to prison on fraud charges. The courts pull his law license. It's a whole scandal. But they still can't nail Kid Can. They still can't nail the godfather of the Minneapolis mob. So what does the federal government do? They nail him for transporting a prostitute across state lines.
Classic.
Yeah, so that's what they finally put him in prison for. Not machine gunning newspaper editors, not for money laundering, not for bootlegging. No, it's for transporting a prostitute across state lines.
I mean, yeah, that sounds pretty par for the course for busting a mobster.
Yeah, I mean, it was considered such a big deal to nail him for transporting a prostitute across state lines that Attorney General Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, gives a speech saying, yeah, we really got this guy. This is a symbol of our war against crime. This is he's giving a speech saying, yeah, we really busted him. This is showing how the administration is really cracking down on this type of criminal activity. And I'm thinking, this is what you catch the guy on? Okay.
Yeah. So, why doesn't Minneapolis seem to reestablish its public transport network?
They have in the 21st century, they've reestablished a lot of their network, and they've rebuilt two of the lines, that existed before World War II and into the 40s. But, the urban planning picture is drastically changed because in the United States, most urban cores now have freeways through them. The only ones which don't in the United States, I'm trying to think and I can't think of a single one. I mean, even Manhattan has has FDR Drive running along the east side of Manhattan and the Henry Hudson Parkway on the west side of Manhattan. It's nothing like the situation in, say, London, where there's no freeways or very little freeway mileage inside the M25, or the Madrid M30, there's no freeways inside there. Same thing for the Paris Boulevard Périphérique. There's just, you're not supposed to drive in the city center. And the U.S. totally remade its cities so that you could drive in the city center, which is, it's just unusual, honestly, talking to Europeans and Aussies and other, people who are not from the States about this, because the idea, what the U.S. did was really unprecedented of anywhere in the developed world. The idea that you would just demolish huge portions of your city center in order to run a freeway through it just seems ridiculous, right? The idea of putting a freeway ring with the Tower of London at one end and Westminster at the other end of it, that idea would be ridiculous. You'd get laughed out of the room in England. That's just never going to happen. But that's exactly what they proposed to do in Washington, D.C., is that, you would have a domino-shaped freeway loop with one half of the domino around Congress and the other half of the domino around the White House. And that's just what the thinking was in the United States at the time. Europe and Australia and New Zealand, and for that matter, Japan and Korea just never had any time for that stuff.
One thing that's got me a little curious, because we mentioned Canada a few times as a point of comparison, is, as noted, Canada also has a somewhat less developed mass transit network, in terms of certain cities at least, compared to, say, Europe. What I'm curious about is whether the zoning difference also matters there. Because we've talked a bit about how that affects the issue in the US. If you can't develop stuff near a train station, then you're not going to build train stations and then you don't get development. Is there a similar situation in Canada historically?
It really depends on your metropolitan area. So Montreal, the entire metro system, pardon me, I need to use the right terminology. In Montreal, virtually the entire metro system is surrounded by old-fashioned like row houses, and it stays mostly within the city center of Montreal, which was well developed before World War II. In Toronto, the subway goes way out into the suburbs, but Toronto tends to cluster apartment buildings and stores and whatever else near the train stations. Vancouver is a very weird bird because they simultaneously have huge amounts of development near the stations, but their zoning restrictions are still very intense. So you have this weird situations where Vancouver has all of these towers, but you also have these, like, you just have vast square miles of these janky copy-paste tract homes from the mid-20th century called Vancouver specials that still will cost you several $1,000,000 in some cases. So yes, zoning plays a role in Canada, but it's very different than the way that it affected the United States, mostly because Canadians don't have the kinds of urban freeways that they do in the States.
To round us off, I mean, is there anything that you thought we ought to cover and that I didn't ask you about?
In putting together all of this stuff about transport and land use in North America, I'm coming out with a book next year on this subject. It really reminds me of that old Agatha Christie novel, like The Murder on the Orient Express, where they all did it. It wasn't. It's really hard to point to one factor and say, well, this is the reason why mass transit in the United States is so bad compared to everywhere else. It's not really just one factor, right? I mean, on the one hand, it is the fact that the U.S. was rich and undamaged by the war, but it's also that the United States has a very complicated racial question that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. But it's also, on top of that, it's like, these transit monopolies that nobody in particular liked. But it's also the fact that the U.S. had the money to do it after the war. There's just lots and lots of interlacing factors that make it really hard to put it all into one neat box, honestly. And each of these cities, it merits really their own. You could write a book on each of these cities if you wanted to. Mm. Like what I've written rather. And so the title is, at least the working title is The Lost Subways of North America. And it's more of a survey than anything else, because to do a deep dive on, say, Detroit requires, it's like, it really does take a deep examination of both like the auto industry and their kind of paternalistic attitudes toward their hometown, but it also requires knowledge of just how complicated race relations are in Detroit compared to other places. And the fact that you have Detroit ringed, at least the city center of Detroit, is ringed not just by the freeways, but also by factories. Because in the early 20th century, they built an orbital railway around the center of Detroit to serve all the automotive factories. And so the city of Detroit didn't really have much of a place to expand to geographically, because nobody wants to live next to a factory. Mm. So, it really is like a question of they all did it. And it's too simplistic just to say, well, these types of things, things ended up this way in the United States because of like one factor. Mm. That said, I think it's wrong, especially for Americans, to say like, well, this sucks. There's nothing we can do about it. Well, no, like this stuff wasn't handed down from the gods, right? This was the product of lots of decisions that made sense at the time. Yeah. And given the fact that things can get done, and you can change things to the way they used to be, or you can take a page out of foreign countries' playbooks and how to get stuff done. Like, this can be done, especially by the wealthiest country on the planet. It's just a question of, do you want to do this? It's the same way with, the California housing crisis, for instance, where, homelessness is out of control because they don't build enough housing. But why don't they build enough housing? Well, it's because it's not legal in a lot of cases, and the political system has not legalized it.
So I did say to round us out earlier, but to round us out for real, because another question emerged from that is potentially decently conclusive. So, is there a history of public transport in the United States, or is it really a lot of separate histories? To what extent is it interconnected?
I don't think you could. So I don't think that you can write a history of public transport in the United States as it is. I mean, I've done my best to write mine, but I don't think that you can really do it justice by trying to cover everything at once. Because there already are lots of local transit histories, and each factor weighs very differently in each place. So if you want to talk about, say, Atlanta, it's a very modern city, and they made an effort in the 1960s and 1970s in particular to be the quote-unquote city too busy to hate. So they did build a modern subway system, but the race question intervened because white people in the suburbs didn't want black people living near them and taking the subway there. So much of the metropolis is just inaccessible by public transit. In comparison, if you go to, say, Seattle, what happened to their public transit is defined in great part by their public process issues and less by the racial question. So, I mean, you can draw on general themes in each place, but you can't necessarily say, I try not to have a universal theory, so to speak.
Well, thank you for coming on. It's been really interesting talking to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.